Secretary General, what can the OECD do? What can Madame Lagarde do at the IMF? What can Dr. Kim do at the World Bank?
Well, I can only speak for the OECD, but I think the idea that discussions are better than applying the tariffs and then provoking this tit for tat, as it is known, clearly is on. It's better to talk. It's better to discuss. And this example of how we ended up dealing with the question of cars and bilateral some voluntary reductions of some of the exports, etc. Well, I think it's a good example of how one can talk about it rather than start to applying tariffs. The problem is not just the areas that are affected, which in this case now you get to the 50 billion mark. They're very large. It's actually a third of the total exports of the United States to China. But the other question is the spillover effects. First of all the Chinese products will be more expensive in the United States, vice versa. But also there will be spillover effects in other sectors. There will be spillover effects in other countries. And there will also be the temptation to go this direction in order to settle any other differences. This is a bad way. It's a lose-lose.
Karen, let me turn to you. Does Europe benefit from this, or does Europe lose from it? It's interesting. So the latest sanctions target the Boeing 737-800. They've limited the weight class for the aircraft that are going to be affected. Airbus sells an A320 aircraft that pretty much matches the 737. Does Europe have an opportunity here, or because it's so geared to the global economy, does it lose out regardless of whether or not it can sell more Airbus aircraft in China?
The latter, Guy. Unfortunately, I think we always see that Europe is the bee to play on global trade. When trade is expanding, when global capex is expanding, as we saw through the course of last year, great news for Europe. The second that starts to roll, Europe is always in the spotlight, and I'm afraid to say, therefore, it's going to remain a loser, even if it's not the epicenter of the discussion.
Absolutely. Everybody loses here. And let me tell you also, remember that there's a very big country. There's a big surplus in one of the European countries.
Yeah. It starts with a G.
Well, yeah, it starts with a G. The problem is you can't negotiate with individual countries when you're talking about trade in the case of Europe. So you have to negotiate with the 28, in a way. And that makes it very difficult to deal with these bilateral surpluses.
And Guy Johnson, I love how you bring Airbus into this, and then Michael McKee, you take it even further and say, wait a minute, we're looking Western-centric, Occidental at Chicago, Seattle, and Toulouse, and you say, no, they're building the planes in China.
Well, this is why it's so complicated, because there are two aircraft producers in the world, civilian aircraft producers that matter, Boeing and Airbus, and China is trying to build a third. But jet aircraft are extraordinarily complicated and difficult to build, and so they are trying to entice the U.S. manufacturers and the European manufacturers over to China to help get some of that intellectual property and some of that expertise. Boeing opening a factory over there. Now, Boeing has demand from China to fill, so it does make some sense for Boeing, but China's long-term plan is to develop its own aircraft company to rival those two. And so if you're getting involved in trade disputes about this, it gets very complicated.
But Mike, it's interesting that Boeing doesn't and Airbus does have a plant in China. So there's a plant in Tianjin, which Airbus has. Currently is mainly focused on narrow bodies, but they're rolling out the 330 there. They're going to be producing 2 aircraft a month from that plant. So are the Europeans more embedded into the China market, and does that now play to their advantage? It's going to be interesting. So you talk to people in Germany at the moment, and they tell you that the flow of the conversation flow between Beijing and Berlin at the moment is incredibly high.
Well, Boeing is opening a plant in China, Guy, and the China Southern Airways chief the other day said they need both companies because they can't produce, neither company can produce enough airlines to meet Chinese demand over the short term, the next 10 years or so. So both companies are being played off against each other by the Chinese. It doesn't appear that either one has a specific advantage. But again, the bottom line is China wants to get the expertise, fill the hole for the time being with Airbus and Boeing, but essentially in the long run, make their own.
We are advantaged, Mr. Secretary General, by you being here today on trade, but I must ask you about your Mexico. Would you please explain for our global audience the distinctions, the interest in this Mexican presidential election? How do you observe that election in your Mexico?
Well, first of all, the election is 2 days old. So the campaign just started 2 days ago. It's very early days. We're going to see changes throughout. It's a 3-month period. So I think it's a little early to say which way it's going to go. And it's going to be mostly the issues. And that's, as usual, the economy. And that's the jobs. There's a security issue. And in this particular election in Mexico, the question of transparency, integrity, and corruption is looming very, very high.
Let us speak of Mexico's northern border. The president put out a single-line tweet yesterday about America's southern border. Please interpret for us how Mexican officials and Mexicans in general look at this caravan from Honduras that is walking north towards America.
I think it is one specific instance of the flow of people that are moving towards, the United States through Mexico. And I think there's what people don't know is the enormous amount of cooperation every day, every hour of the day between the United States and Mexico that goes on in order to deal with these issues. As the flow from Mexico to the United States has ebbed and sometimes become even negative in terms of Mexicans returning to Mexico as opportunities have cropped up, etc., then the question of the Central Americans is something that one has to deal with because they go through Mexico, and it just requires, and actually it's happening in the ground, that greater and greater cooperation between Mexico and the United States is helping to deal with this issue.
The higher the trade tensions get between China and the United States, can I assume that that turns into the more likelihood that we get a deal on NAFTA done? I.e., the more we look over here, do we need to get a win over here? Do you think it's how it's going to work?
No, Guy, I think that nobody wins. This is bad. And it's also, it mixes up a number of issues which should not be mixing up. Today we have all these arguments about the border and about the wall and about this and about NAFTA and about, but then there are other questions. There's chorus in the case of Korea, and then there's a question of the issues with the steel and the aluminum for the countries that were not exempted. But then there's the exemption, which is up to the end of May. I mean, what's going to happen after the end of May? How is that going to be dealt with? It looks like it's some kind of a Damocles sword which is hanging in there. What's going to happen after that? So these things have to be resolved, and they have to be resolved in a way which is consistent, and that means that free trade has proven over the last 50, 60, 70 years that is net positive, okay? The question of the modalities maybe have to be adjusted. NAFTA, for example, when NAFTA was actually launched and created, it's been good for everybody, but there was no internet then, so it has to be updated, it has to be upgraded, it has to be changed. So we're not saying this doesn't have to be done, but the question is those instruments that created competitive regions like NAFTA today is vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And then with products coming in from the rest of the world into NAFTA, of course, they have to be strengthened and updated, upgraded, modernized.